Okay, so welcome to week 3. This is the interview section of the series. So we're here with a pen maker called Paul. We're going to go and set up for the interview, so I'll talk you through the ins and outs of what it is we'll need to capture him and his story in its best light. So I'd always start off by getting my tripod out and setting up the camera so I can get my framing. So I do that before I'd get any lighting. I've used the app on my phone, which is Cadridge. And that has helped me kind of get an idea of like the type of framing, focal length that I'd use. You can put in your custom camera settings or what camera you're using and the lens you're using into that app. That does help just initially, before you get any kit out, work out what type of framing it is that you'll need to do before you get any kit out. So one thing I always do with the tripod is just, for a video style tripod, is extend the bottom legs first, because these are the more awkward ones. So if I need to extend the height up here, because there are 3 points you have to undo, it's just a bit easier to do them at the top, and you can just kind of keep an eye on the camera, make sure it's not going to topple or anything like that. So I can adjust the height just using the top ones. It's a lot easier than having to reach down and grab the lower ones from all of them. In terms of lenses, my lens selection, I've gone with out of the two that I've got for this, the 24 to 105. It just gives me a bit more range. The 85 prime that I've got is probably going to be a bit too tight for this space, and it's a macro lens as well, so we'll use that later when we're doing the kind of more close-up stuff, when the actual kind of action is happening. But so for the interview, we're just going to go with the 24 to 105. It's just going to allow me to kind of frame up a lot easier for this interview. So the other thing with tripod is when doing an interview, I'll almost always use a tripod unless it's like run and gun. Reason being is that it allows me to interact with my interview subject a lot more without having to worry about the camera. I don't have to keep an eye on the camera's kind of framing or anything like that. I know the framing is going to be the same when I start as to when it ends. It just means that I can kind of set it and forget it almost. So the only thing I would need to kind of keep an eye on or an ear on is just the audio, make sure that we're capturing the audio. But I'll have headphones in for that, so that's easy to do without necessarily looking at the camera too much. What I want is to engage with the client or the subject as much as possible, maintain that eye contact between the two of us, and just leave the camera to kind of capture the interaction between the two of us. So that's why kind of best to use a tripod. Using a video one, video specific as opposed to like a stills tripod, you have this little lever underneath here, or a little screw underneath here, that just allows you to move this ball head. So if your legs aren't adjusted, or if the floor isn't as even as you need it to be, you can just adjust it, and you've got like a little bubble level on the back, and that just means that you can set your horizon to be nice and straight. So when you come to shoot, everything should be pretty straight in your viewfinder or in your LCD. So I've just explained to Paul, who's our subject for the day, who we're going to interview, just kind of roughly about where I want him to stand. That way I can get my framing before I start to bring in the lighting for it. How I'm going to conduct the interview is I'm actually going to be stood just off camera, so he can talk to me. With people that aren't used to kind of being in front of the camera, it can be quite daunting to kind of look straight down the barrel of the lens. So it's normally best just to get them to talk to you and to ignore the camera. So I'll be stood off camera so he can talk to me, so we can have a more conversational kind of interview style and find out a bit more without the kind of camera being too much of a distraction. Okay, so I've set up a couple bits, as you'll notice. I've set up the lighting. So what we're using here is just a daylight panel light. So it's actually a bi-color one, so we could do like slightly warmer lighting if we wanted to. So that just means that it can go from, I believe, 3600 Kelvin all the way up to 6500 Kelvin. So we can go very blue with our lighting if we want to. But what we want to do is just balance the light. I've also turned off the lights in the space here, and that just helps me control the lighting a little bit more. We do have this really nice daylight coming in, which is why I've used a daylight, so 5600 on the panel light that we've got here, so it matches the color temperature of the light coming in. And all I'm using this light for is just to kind of accentuate that light that's coming in, have a bit more control over it. So trying to make it look as natural as possible, because we can see in my framing here that there is a hint of there being a window to this side. So what we want to do is just make sure that the lighting that comes in looks very natural. So I've specifically not lit Paul's right hand side, so left hand side of the frame, because that will wrap around really nicely, so we're not getting too much of a shadow on one side. I've also popped an external monitor on top of my camera. This is a monitor I shoot all of my stuff with, so I'm very familiar with how it should look. So this gives me, so it doesn't matter what camera I'm using, very familiar with this, and this travels with me for any shoots. Any camera that I'm using, it's got SDI and HDMI, which are two different connection types. SDI being like a more of a professional one, but the R5 C has HDMI out, so I've got a HDMI to HDMI cable, which plugging that in, and I've got different things like focus peaking, which helps me make sure that my subject is as sharp as possible. I also have things like zebras to show me if it's too overexposed or what the exposure level is, and those are the main ones that I'll use from this monitor. And it has a couple of LUTs built in as well, so I can just see what the end result might look like once it's been color graded. So that's why I'm using an external monitor. A couple of batteries on it should last me a good few hours of recording time, and it's also got kind of all of my audio levels on here as well. So I just use it as a bit more of a bigger comprehensive monitor, just to view all of my recording information on. So yeah, that's why I've got those two bits all set up now. Okay, so this is a grey card. You have grey on one side and white on the other, and this helps you with colour balancing or doing your white balance. So you want to do a custom white balance in your camera itself, which you'll be able to do in almost any camera. This just really helps, and I know most people say white balance, so you want to use white. These can be a little bit too reflective, so grey gives you this like middle grey, as it's called, and that just helps you do your white balance. So for example, if you wanted to do it on me being the subject here, what I'd want to do is get this as close to me as possible, so we're getting the light that's coming in from the ambient light plus any other light sources that we might get, and this will give you a really good readout. You want to try and fill your white balance frame, so some cameras will take a white balance from the whole scene, which isn't the best. Ideally you want to take a white balance from a spot or a point, and you want to get that right in the middle, and this will help you just balance your exposure. Really helps when you are in mixed lighting. In here we have some fluorescent tubes as well. We do have them off at the moment, but if we needed to kind of pull in a bit more light and we didn't have it on set with like additional lighting, we did need to put like what we call the house lights on. You'd need to use this to like balance out the light, because otherwise you're going to get a mix of daylight, which is around 5800 depending on the time of day. It might be a bit warmer now, to very warm kind of tungsten lights, which will be more towards of the 4300 Kelvin or even warmer. So this will just help you pull out that good kind of skin tones especially, and that's really where you'll lose a lot of the color is in skin tones, and it's really hard to get back. If you're shooting raw in photography, it's quite easy to do because you can re-white balance stuff, and there is raw in a lot of cameras now, but that does take up a lot of space in terms of your media, and not all cameras have it. So you know, the camera that you might be using might not be able to shoot raw, therefore you're not going to be able to white balance after you've shot. So whatever your white balance is at the time of filming, that's what you're stuck with. So it's really important to get something like this, bring it along to your shoots. This is really little. This is a Elastomeric one. I have had this for many years, and it just goes in my main camera bag. They fold up really small, so in terms of like footprint, very, very little. You can get much bigger ones depending on what you need and depending on your subject and how far you need to be away from your camera. But they're really, really, really useful. They're pretty cheap. The Elastomeric ones, as I said, do last for ages. They are kind of stain and water resistant and stuff, just in case you need them or drop them or anything like that. So really, really useful piece of kit, and for the price will get you out of a lot of trouble with mixed lighting. So just to give an example of how this works, we've purposefully set the behind the scenes camera that we're rolling on at the moment to be too cold. So it should be quite blue on your frame at the moment. And we'll show you how this works using the auto white balance. So just pop this out again. So we'll have this in a place that will pick up the light that's very similar to my face. You might want to hold it over your face, or over the face of your subject, or in front of your subject. But by using the auto white balance function within the camera, this should then pick up and show me really good skin tones and balance the frame as to what you'd see with your natural eye. Okay, in terms of ISO settings for the camera, what we'll be shooting at is what's called a base ISO, which is the ISO that is gives us our cleanest and highest dynamic range. For this camera's dual native ISO is 800 and 3200, which if you're coming from photography might seem quite high, but this is very typical for shooting in log, which we've already discussed. So it's very typical for shooting in log that the ISO is higher because it gives you basically a much greater dynamic range through the sensor. You can shoot lower in these. Not all cameras allow you to shoot lower than like a base native ISO. So things, if you're shooting in S-Log with Sony's, their lowest ISO for most of the S-Log color profiles will be 800, so you won't be able to shoot anything lower than that. Because of the kind of high sensitivity that the sensor will have, you'll be capturing a lot brighter scenes, so you might need to use something like a variable ND. This will just give you the opportunity to kind of cut down the light levels. Just think of it as like a pair of sunglasses for your lens. Variable means that you can change it from it letting in like not a lot of light to it letting in more, and this is done by using, it basically stacks two polarizing filters on top of each other, and then you're just rotating one round, so it just allows more or less light to come through the front of the lens onto the sensor. You can get what's called color cast with this as well. They're not always the most color accurate, especially the cheaper models. So using that grey card again will give you a better chance of having a more accurate color if it does color cast. Typically you might get greens or like slightly purpley kind of colors coming through across your image. More expensive ones tend to have this reduced. If you switch to hard NDs, so like regular NDs, they're not variable, so you have to pick the ND based on how bright the scene is, and they will come in stops, so 0.3, 0.6, 0.9, 1.2, and if you use something like a matte box, you can stack them on top of each other. This will just allow you to cut down the amount of light as a full amount, but if your light levels are changing, if you're doing run and gun kind of stuff, you'll need to keep switching these in and out, which does take time. For more planned and thought through kind of setups and scenes where you're using more of your own lighting, and you might want to cut down some of the background light whilst using a light to light your subject, then using like a hard ND like that will give you the kind of light control you need coming through, whilst kind of sticking with the base ISO and using like a wider aperture to get that shallow depth of field. Okay, so on this monitor, if I drag down, I have this little box. So I'll just explain, this display around the outside is exactly the same as what's on the main monitor. So it's just feeding me all the information. So I don't necessarily have to have that screen out. I can just work off this one, but it's not a touch screen to operate the camera. This is a touch screen just to operate the monitor's functions. With this monitor, you can put an SD card inside and you can record like a backup recording to it. We've got our own individual audio bars here. So the ones on the right hand side are from the camera. These are the ones that the monitor's picking up. This is my histogram for the feed through as well. So that is pretty much where I'd expect it to be. So we're not losing too much. You see this like a little bit of heat in this kind of spiky bit here and spiky bit there, but it's not going over the kind of threshold. So on here, I mentioned focus peaking, which is this kind of red outline. You can customize this. I'm high at the moment, so I like a really vivid focus peaking. So that just helps me make sure that my subject is in focus. So as I go in and out of focus, you can see that it kind of accentuates the red area of the sharper parts of Paul's face there. I'll also bring up zebras, so that's just here. So if I bring this down, you'll see these kind of stripy bits up in this top bit of the corner, and just on the right hand side. So they're the zebras. So Currently, these are set to 95%, which just shows me that with this camera specifically, that we might lose detail in these areas up here. So it's just that the highlights are blown out. So yeah, if when it comes to kind of grading, there might not be enough information to actually bring those back. So if we look at them on screen, you can see they're really quite bright. They're edge of frame, so it doesn't bother me too much. But what we could do, if I pop the zebras back on, if I change the aperture to stop down a little bit, you notice they're still quite bright up there, but we are starting to kind of lose those. But we also lose a lot of the brightness of our subject as well. So I'm going to keep it at f4.5 as originally set up for the lighting, and I'm fine with losing a bit of detail there. Okay, so I've got the Rode Filmmaker kit, which is the audio kit that I'll be using for this interview. So this just comprises of a little body pack, which I will pop in Paul's pocket, and that will have the microphone attached to it. And then there's the receiver section, and this will go on my camera, and this will just be connected. And this is just a 3.5mm jack that plugs from here into the camera. Most cameras will have one of these in. Kind of larger, more professional cameras have an XLR. You can get XLR adapters for these as well. So we'll start setting those up. I've put some fresh batteries in. I always use Duracell, like the best kind of AA's. They are the better ones, cheaper. Batteries do not last as long and they don't give you as consistent an output. And if you're using rechargeables, then something like the Panasonic Eneloops are the better ones to go for, and just get a good charger. Other than that, I wouldn't bother with any other batteries personally. I've just not had great experiences with them. Now, in terms of the microphone, this is the mic that comes with the Rode Filmmaker kit. And that just has a little screw thread attachment which will plug into the transmitter. And then this little bit is like an Invisilav. So what we can do with this is it hides really well. So we'll put like a little bit of double-sided sticky on the back there. We'll be able to stick this, unlike my microphone, which is a clip-on here, we'll be able to stick this underneath Paul's apron that he's got on there. Is apron, is that right? So we'll be able to put that underneath Paul's apron that he's wearing, and that just hides it out of the way. So it kind of makes it a little bit more like seamless. So you don't see the microphone in the actual shot, which adds like a kind of a bit more of a level of professionalism to it. And you can kind of get these separate. So these are specific for the Rode ones, and then you can buy stickies for it, but you can just get a roll of like body safe double-sided sticky tape. And I've had this for years and still going. So yeah, just stick a bit to that, peel off the back of it, stick it to the inside of their shirt. But I've mounted this in all sorts of places. Hats, so if they're wearing like thick jackets, if they're wearing a hat, if it's cold, you can mount it in here, tuck the cable behind them to the back. That works really well. Even peaked caps, if they're not, you can stick it to there. They're quite easy to hide. Yes, you can like put them in all sorts of places. You don't have to use them as like a on-body one either. If you can like hide them in like flowers or something like that. If they're on a table and you want to capture more than one person, you need to crank the audio a little bit to capture that, but they're very, very versatile as a little solution. So something like this is really good to kind of pick up as like a first microphone or first lav style microphone to use for interviews and all sorts. So I'm just gonna kind of sort this out and get Paul mic'd up and then just go through some tests with him. Okay, so I've just mic'd Paul up. He's got the Invisilav, which is just sitting, so it points up towards his chin, so that's where he's going to project from, obviously. I'm going to pop the receiver onto here. Now, normally with cameras that I shoot, they'll be in a cage system, so that's a way of like mounting multiple things to them. Don't have that on this camera. So what we've done is we've got like a little hot or cold shoe mount for the monitor, and I put like had one in my store of many camera bits and accessories. So I popped one on the side of the cage for my monitor. So that just allows me to connect this to the monitor so it's nice and safe and secure. I can monitor the little LCD screen on the back, and I'll be able to just connect this into the port for the microphone on the camera, so I can monitor it all, and I'll connect my headphones to that as well. But yeah, so that's everything mic'd up. So we can now do some audio tests once I plug my headphones in, and we can start with the interview. Okay, so one other little tip that I can give is just Lowepro make these what are called gear wraps. I've got quite a few of these, all for different things. So in these you can kind of store, it's got like cable holders if you want to pop a pen in there. I'll put SSDs in there, additional cables, wipes and stuff. So I have one just for like my filmmaking stuff. So I've got this little set of in-ear audio monitoring. I really like these. I don't know if these are, if you can get these anymore, but I really like these because they have a really short cable. And that's one thing I find, like having a really long 2-3 meter cable is just too much when I'm managing audio on a camera that I'm kind of holding. They also come with like a little extender as well, so if I do need to get a bit further away, I can. But that's something I really like. And when I'm kind of doing more like run and gun, or if it's just me on my own, I tend to use in-ears as opposed to like over-ear headphones. Mainly because they're like a bit more kind of comfortable. I can have like one ear so I can hear the kind of ambient audio as well. So I've noticed today we're not that far from an airfield, so we do have planes flying over. So what we want to do is just ideally capture very clean audio. If I've got headphones on, I can obviously pick that up through the microphone, but I want to be able to hear that before the headphones or before the microphone picks them up. The microphone's a bit closer in its pickup pattern for the audio. So I'll hear like a plane flying over, you know, maybe 3 or 4 seconds before it actually hits, so I can kind of pause the interview there. We can kind of go when the plane's cleared. So I just like to hear kind of what's happening, which is why I just have like one ear in to make sure that the audio is coming through nice and cleanly, and then one ear free just to monitor everything else. Okay, so I've just done some audio checks with Paul. So what I'm looking for here is just to make sure that the bars on the back aren't going too high. Most audio bars will give you like a color, so green, then kind of amber or yellow, and then red, so red being an area that you don't want to hit. Ideally just keep it in the green, so you want to adjust your audio input on your camera to just make sure that when they're speaking that it doesn't go above that kind of green threshold. Now to do that, I always ask just a generic kind of question, so that could be you know, what did you have for breakfast? Just something that's gonna get a longer kind of form answer, so you can kind of play around with the settings to make sure that the audio is at its best level. This as a unit itself will output onto left and right channels within the audio. I've separated those out, which most cameras will allow you to do. And I always have my left channel to be a percentage lower than my right channel. So what that allows me to do is, if there's a section where Paul does talk a little louder than other bits, if that does clip, so as in if the audio does go to the red bar, what that will do is it will distort if it goes too high. So having that second channel that is lower in its input will just mean that I can switch to that in the edit to make sure that I don't lose or distort any of the audio during the edit, so we get everything really nice and clean. Okay, so in terms of my question set, now you can print them off. I prefer to use an iPad because I'm not printing stuff and wasting paper. It also means that I can edit them on the go. This morning I sat down with Paul and just asked him a few questions just to find out like a little bit more about him, so almost like a pre-interview, just to make sure that, you know, the question set that I've got that we've already developed is kind of represents like the full accuracy of what we want to get out of this, and also it might uncover a few more bits that I didn't necessarily know about. So Paul and I also had a phone call a couple of weeks ago whilst we were setting this up, where we kind of talked about some of the ins and outs of what he does. So again, I was able to build my question set as we've already been through from that initial kind of discussion. So during the interview, I've got my set of questions. What I'll also do is ask Paul to put some context in the answers back to me. So that just means that my voice isn't going to be in the edit itself. So it's just going to be just Paul's answers. So for example, we're putting context in. If I was to ask, what's your favorite color? Most people just say blue because you're having a conversation. Whereas what we actually want is, if I was to say, what's your favorite color? Then the person answering would be, my favorite color is blue. So it's a context in the answer. So my voice isn't going to be in it. The interviewer isn't going to be in it, it's just the interviewee. So yeah, it's just making sure you get that context within all of the answers. So we'll go through that. I'm just going to bring up my questions here, and then once that's ready, we can start rolling with our interview. Okay, so I've got my questions set ready, about to go into the interview with Paul. As I said before, to kind of make him a little bit more comfortable, and the same I do with any subject, especially someone who I'm filming for the first time with. I'm going to do this kind of off camera, so we'll be very, very kind of conversational, as you'll kind of see with the kind of behind the scenes footage. So it'll be quite conversation in terms of how I answer questions and the delivery from Paul. And then I have I have 10 or so questions that are written down. But as we go along through the interview, we might find that actually I want to find out a little bit more about a certain topic that Paul's talking about. So I'll kind of add in a few more questions on the fly as we go. And that sort of thing comes with experience and stuff. So being prepared is like a very good thing to kind of come to the interview with your question set and to go through those. But as you get a bit more comfortable with interviewing people and with asking questions, you will start to kind of think of questions on the fly. But it's all about kind of making your subject comfortable. So as I said, shooting off camera. So Paul talking to me instead of straight down the lens of our main camera here is a better way of getting a more natural, kind of easier delivery. So before we get started with going through the questions, I'm just going to run through them kind of with Paul. Typically, I don't hand the questions over to who I'm interviewing before the shoot because I want them to be not scripted. So I don't want them to think about them too much. But just going through the question set just before you kind of press record is just a good way to kind of get the thought process going about how they'll answer those questions. So having a little bit of kind of preparedness from who you're interviewing is good, but just not allowing them to kind of script things. You get a much more natural delivery. So we've just finished our interview with Paul. One thing that you might have noticed from the behind the scenes footage that we've been filming whilst I was doing that is just keeping that engagement with Paul. So I do have my kind of questions on my iPad, but it's just making sure I'm not spending too much time kind of looking at that, especially when he's kind of talking to me, but also just knowing what my next question is. So there's not too much like dead time between like Paul's answer and my next question, just to kind of keep that conversation flow going. So things like just like maintaining eye contact as if it's like a normal conversation. Just, obviously you don't want to say anything whilst they're speaking because that's going to be picked up in the audio. So you do need to kind of maintain like silence from yourself all the way through it. Make sure you're in a comfortable spot. We were both stood up. It's not often that I do kind of stand up kind of interviews like this. More often we'll be kind of sat down just so it's a bit comfortable. Also, especially if you're doing like a longer interview. But the scene itself just sets us to stand up in this situation. So it's really just about kind of nodding as kind of he's talking, just so you are showing that you are like listening and showing that you're interested in his answers. You need to kind of pull those and get those really good answers from your interviewee. So just having that interest there, and then just occasionally I'll glance down at my questions just to make sure that there's I know what the next one is. So as soon as he's finished his last answer, I can kind of quickly just go into the next one, or I can come up with a question for him based on what his last answer was. So there's a couple of occasions within that interview then where I asked him just to kind of go in a little bit deeper with one of the answers or one or two of the answers that he gave me, just because I wanted to find out a bit more about some specifics from those questions. Okay, so we've just done our interview. I just want to talk about like positioning. So I've just played back the footage here, so we've got it on kind of both the screens there. Now, in terms of framing, I'll just bring up my guides here. So I've got these thirds guides, and what I'll typically do is put my subject on one of the third lines, one of the vertical ones. So what this allows me to do is give them a bit of space to look into. So you always need to kind of give them space to look into, and that's where they're talking to. So I was obviously stood this side of the camera, so Paul was looking towards me, so we want to give him the biggest amount of space on this side of the frame that he can look into. So that's the end of our third part for the series. Now, so we've kind of covered like the importance of what we need to do in interviews, and just make sure you join us for the fourth section, which is the kind of contextualizing what we've done. So shooting B-roll and supporting footage. Now, before we go, if I can just like leave you with 3 tips. My 3 tips for interviews would be, obviously talk to your subject before, like way before the shoot. When you first introduce yourself, jump on the phone, like even a Zoom call, or get down to where it is that you're going to be filming. Just find out about them so you can really dig into the kind of questions that you might want to ask them. So that's my first tip. Second tip, pop it on a tripod, especially if you're on your own. Shooting your interview section on a tripod will really help you concentrate on the interview itself and not be distracted by kind of monitoring the camera or having to monitor the camera the whole time. And my third and final tip is shoot the interview as beautifully as possible. So light it well, make sure your audio is good, because it's going to be something that you can fall back on if you don't have enough B-roll. So if you've not planned your B-roll out enough, if you want to cut back to your interview, it's really important to get the interview looking really good, because it will really nicely support the footage that you've got, and it also gives context onto who that person is. You want to see that person up front, otherwise we could just record the audio on its own. So by doing an interview with someone, filming it really nicely, spending the time to kind of position that person, to light them really well, is going to really help your final piece and final story.